currently a subject of hot debate among physicians and patients.
So what I would say is that the available data is not methodologically strong enough that there's a consensus in the field.
Roughly 1 in 10 Americans take antidepressants. The most common types are SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Think Prozac, Lexapro, Zoloft. But what happens when you stop taking them? There's an ongoing debate among physicians and patients about the severity and prevalence of SSRI withdrawal symptoms. And discourse reached a fever pitch when HHS Secretary Kennedy compared SSRI withdrawal to heroin withdrawal. So there have been studies, but they sometimes contradict each other, and the takeaway isn't so clear. Joining me now to discuss the issue and dig into the data on SSRI withdrawal are my guests. Dr. Avais Aftab, Clinical Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Case Western Reserve University, based in Cleveland, Ohio, and Dr. Mark Horowitz, Clinical Research Fellow in the UK's National Health Service and scientific co-founder of Outro Health, who's based in London, England. I want to welcome you both to Science Friday.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thank you.
It seems like there's a lot of disagreement about this issue, about SSRI withdrawal. I mean, is it lighting up the psychiatry community? Are researchers arguing about this in hotel ballrooms somewhere? Avais?
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's a pretty heated debate going on, and I think a fundamental problem is that we have a relative lack of good research and good data, especially about long-term outcomes. I think some of the most interesting and intense debates are happening online at the moment.
Mark, this is personal for you. I mean, this is professional for you, but it's also personal for you. You took antidepressants for a decade. What was your experience coming off of them?
I learned at medical school in my psychiatry training the same things that Awais has been taught and other psychiatrists, that coming off antidepressants is generally fairly easy. There's brief and mild symptoms and doesn't cause much trouble. You know, and that is true if you've been on the drugs for 8 to 12 weeks, because a lot of the research that was done by drug companies looked at people who've been on the drugs for a few weeks. But when I came off my antidepressants, which I tried to do the first time about 10 years ago, I was hit by a raft of symptoms that I hadn't expected. I had trouble sleeping. I would wake up in complete terror, like I was being chased by a wild animal. And that would last for hours and hours of the day. And that went on and on for week after week. In fact, it went on for months until I was forced to go back on the medication. And I should say that, you know, these symptoms were nothing like the symptoms that I had gone on antidepressants for many years beforehand as a slightly dissatisfied medical student. And that was a real wake-up call to me that what I had learned in textbooks from short-term studies was not reflected, at least for me, in coming off after long-term use. And I soon realized that it wasn't an isolated experience for me, but something that happened to tens, if not hundreds of thousands of other people.
You know, when I listen to this story, the thing that comes to mind is, you know, you work in this field. If this is such a common experience, why did you not know about it? Where was the breakdown?
Great question. In my clinical practice, working as a psychiatrist in Australia and the UK, we very seldom stopped medications that wasn't replaced by another medication, and we very seldom followed people up. You know, psychiatry is very much focused on crisis. When people are in trouble, they want to do things to patch people up. And it falls down the list of priorities, taking people off medication. So it is not a very big part of practice. In my training, I also didn't receive any lectures on stopping medications, I should say. And that is because there is such a big focus on starting things and not such a big focus on stopping things. That's reflected in research literature, in guidelines, clinical practice, and people's experience. And I did actually have a sort of series of flashbacks where I realized that many patients that I had seen were suffering from withdrawal effects, and I had misdiagnosed them with a relapse of their condition or something else, some other mental health problem, because I had not been aware at the time of what was going on. So I completely understand my colleagues who don't see these things, because it is very hard to see what you haven't been trained to see, and I have stood in their shoes, so I understand completely.
I mean, how can you tell if a patient is having withdrawal symptoms versus relapse?
You know, a few things are, one, there are distinctive symptoms in withdrawal that don't occur in relapse. So there's a whole host of physical symptoms, headaches, dizziness. Brain zaps is a particularly distinctive one.
What's a brain zap?
So a brain zap is a sort of sensation of a little electric shock in your head, or that someone has sort of switched your brain off for a second. The other issue, though, is that the most common withdrawal symptoms from antidepressants are psychological symptoms, things like anxiety, low mood, panic attacks, even feeling suicidal. And we know that these are withdrawal symptoms because they occur in people who stop antidepressants who are not put on them for mental health difficulties. So in people who are put on them for pain or the menopause, or even in healthy volunteers. And patients will often say that. They'll say, when I came off my medication, I had symptoms that I'd never had before, or they were much more severe. The other issue is when the symptoms come on. Withdrawal symptoms often come on in a few hours or days of a missed dose, although they can also be delayed by weeks, which really confuses patients and doctors. We think that's because there are downstream effects that take time to reach a threshold that can confuse people. Response to medication is more useful in retrospect. Sometimes when medication is restarted soon after people stop their medications, withdrawal symptoms quickly resolve, although for some people it can take longer.
Do you see this problem as overlooked in the same way that Mark does?
Yes, I agree. The problem has been overlooked. And from the very beginning, there was no systematic research around what happens when antidepressant medication just stops, what kind of experiences people have. And to the extent that there was some awareness that withdrawal symptoms happen, they were conceptualized under the category of discontinuation syndrome or discontinuation symptoms, which was essentially a kind of branding that was partly driven by pharmaceutical interest. And so it created this idea that whatever is happening with stopping antidepressants, it's a different kind of thing than withdrawal, and it is milder. And it never received systematic study. And because it never received that kind of research funding and support, clinicians on the ground had very little idea of it. Because we didn't have scientific data, textbooks generally neglected it. And also the kind of clinical culture that we have, in many Western countries, there are incentives and pressures to keep the person on the medication, and there is relatively less support for them to come off it. So all of that, I think, acted in coordination. It is also the case that the question of whether a person is experiencing a return of the depression or development of a new, let's say, anxiety, condition versus withdrawal, the lines are also kind of blurred. There are clear situations where you can say this looks like a return of depression or a return of anxiety, but there's pretty gray area in between where a person's prior mental illness and their vulnerability towards mental illness interacts with the fact that they have also developed a dependence on medication. And how to navigate that gray area is also tricky.
What percentage of people who are on antidepressants long term have these severe withdrawal symptoms? Do we know?
Yeah, so what I would say is that the available data is not methodologically strong enough that there's a consensus in the field. The studies that are available, they suggest a higher percentage, something around 40 to 50%, sometimes even more. But because of various considerations around how these studies were conducted, many people in the field remain kind of unpersuaded or unconvinced.
I have a different view to Awais. I think that's not true what he's just outlined. There are very high quality studies on long-term use that I think psychiatrists like to ignore. There are studies that are done that are double-blinded, so people don't know if they're being taken off the drugs. They're rated with objective instruments. It's after being on the drugs for a year, and they find that 2/3 of people who come off antidepressants after more than a year have withdrawal effects, and that they show that these symptoms have profound impairments in terms of their functioning day to day. So I think we do have good evidence that it is around, could be 50%, but most of these studies show about 2/3 of people have withdrawal effects. I do agree with Awais, though, that a big part of this is how long people have been on the drugs for. And short-term users do have minor problems, longer-term users have more major problems. And of course, in America, there are more than 25 million people who are on these drugs for more than 5 years, and they are in the category of people that are having more severe, more long-lasting, and more disabling symptoms.
One thing I want to mention is that a big element of the controversy is that there's a mismatch between what many clinicians see in their practice and what some of the research studies around long-term use suggest. And and I myself, I've been kind of looking and reading the antidepressant withdrawal literature for many years now. I work in a general psychiatric setting, so I work with all kinds of patients with depression, anxiety, mood disorders who have been on antidepressants for many years. And while I do see a small percentage of people struggling, intensely with withdrawal issues, I would say the kind of like the average person seems to kind of handle the withdrawal symptoms quite well with a gentle taper that lasts a couple of weeks.
One of the implications in all of this is that patients are not reliable commentators of their own experience. Part of this is, look, psychiatric patients, they take antidepressants, they're a funny bunch of people. Can we really take them seriously? There's a very big epistemic injustice underlying all this. But we know that 1 in 2 people in America have been offered an antidepressant at some point in their life. So this is not a very small, disturbed group of people. This is almost everybody out there.
I would say another big thing is that I think what is the exact percentage of people who have withdrawal is an important question, but also practically not the most important one. I think practically the most important thing is that people who are experiencing significant difficulties with withdrawal, what needs to be done for them? How can we best handle these individuals? And also, how can we prevent severe withdrawal from happening? So I think that's where the focus of clinical research and scientific efforts should be, is what is the safest way of tapering antidepressants and what is the safest way of getting people off them.
After the break, how do you get off SSRI antidepressants? We'll talk about a promising approach to mitigating severe withdrawal symptoms.
Patients are often told, you're on a very small dose of a drug, you can just stop it. But the brain doesn't care about the size of tablet you're swallowing. It cares about the effect of that drug on the brain.
If you're watching the Apple TV Plus series, you're going to want to listen to Feathers and Fire, the podcast from Hawaii Public Radio that takes a closer look at the groundbreaking series. Our hosts provide additional context to the Hawaiian history and culture portrayed in the series, as well as humorous insight and behind-the-scenes stories from guests. Available wherever you get your podcasts and from hawaiipublicradio.org.
So, you both agree that there are people who are suffering from severe withdrawal. So what is the solution for those people who are having this hellish experience?
There are no randomized controlled trials yet looking at how best to take people off their drugs. But it seems from many observational studies that the slower you come off an antidepressant, the less likely it is to cause withdrawal effects in the short or long term. And people use an analogy to something like altitude sickness. The quicker you go up a mountain, the more likely you are to get into trouble because your body can't adapt to the change in air pressure. If you go up the mountain more slowly, you're less likely to get altitude sickness. And the same seems to be true for coming off psychiatric drugs. Our brains and bodies get used to these drugs. If we reduce it in small amounts over time, it gives the brain and body time to readapt to the drug not being there. And that tends to reduce the risk of withdrawal effects. And that for many patients means coming off over months and sometimes more than a year. And because of the particular pharmacology of the drugs, the last few milligrams are much harder to come off than the first few milligrams. And so it makes sense to go slower and slower as you get down to lower doses.
Oh. And you developed this model, right? This slow tapering model.
Yes. So we published a paper on it. It's called Hyperbolic Tapering. And I should say that many tens of thousands of patients had worked out the same thing themselves through trial and error over many decades, often without medical help. How do we reduce our medication in a way that we can tolerate? And it was quite a eureka moment for me when I realized that this pattern of reducing that patients had worked out exactly matches the neuroimaging of these drugs and their effect on the brain. And so I think it is a technique that tends to work, and I use it in my clinic, and there's now research projects going on to try to define it better.
And that means, I assume, using liquid, right? Because you can't, how many times you can't split a pill down to the crumbs, right?
Exactly, you've got to the crux of the matter, which is that the existing tablets or capsules available at pharmacies for all antidepressants have a very large effect on the brain. So patients are often told, you're on a very small dose of a drug, you can just stop it. But the brain doesn't care about the size of tablet you're swallowing. It cares about the effect of that drug on the brain, on its receptors. And so to sort of get down that hill, you need to use, exactly like you just mentioned, liquids or specially compounded tablets or capsules. And that way people can get off that last sort of steep hill to get down off their drugs.
I think the method of tapering that Mark is describing, the gradual hyperbolic tapering, I think it's been a wonderful development. And at the same time, we have to recognize that we don't have good high quality evidence from clinical trials, especially kind of blinded and randomized clinical trials, about the benefits of hyperbolic tapering. It's hard to say that which method is the best one for an average person who uses antidepressant medications. But I do think kind of for people who are having difficulty coming off them, hyperbolic tapering is at the moment the best one.
I am noticing personally, as someone who covers science week in, week out, and has done that for decades, a kind of dangerous flattening of science from all directions. And I wanted your perspective on that. Is there a way for us to better acknowledge uncertainty in science? How do we make uncertainty great again?
That's a good line. I think there is a very worrying flattening of science. Science is it's a way of generating new knowledge, and it's also a kind of institution of power. And I think that dissenting voices have been quieted again and again in medicine. One thing I wanted to point out is that this is actually a repeat story. The same thing happened with benzodiazepines. Doctors said they don't have major withdrawal effects. It's not everybody. We don't think it's physiological. It might be up to the patients. It might be relapse. But what happens is there's a certain line, it benefits professionals, it comes from industry, and patient voices are quieted. It takes independent researchers without great funding, decades to build up the evidence base to prove that something is not what it was represented to be. And so I really think that we have to learn from past experience and be open to new ideas, because otherwise, we've learned great harm is done to patients. So I do think we need to be more open-minded and not so quick to censor dissenting voices, which is happening so much now in psychiatry.
Yeah, my view is that I think we have to openly acknowledge that this is an area in which there's a lot of disagreement in the field and there are a lot of unknowns. And the reason there is disagreement is that we lack the kind of high quality research that can persuade people. And so the answer, I think, is that major funding organizations, they have to make this topic a priority. They have to make research around medication harms and stopping medications a priority. And if they fund research that investigates this issue, we will have the data that resolves these unsettled questions.
I want to thank you both for taking the time to talk with me today on the show.
Thanks, Flora.
Yeah, thank you for covering this.
Dr. Avais Aftab, Clinical Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, and Dr. Mark Horowitz, Clinical Research Fellow in the UK's National Health Service and scientific co-founder of Outro Health. He's based in London, England. If you like the show, rate and review us wherever you listen, or just go straight to guerrilla marketing. Take a friend's phone and subscribe them to this podcast. Please help us get the word out about science writing. Today's episode was produced by Shoshana Buxbaum. I'm Flora Lichtman. Thanks for listening.
Hi, this is Ira Plato, and you're listening to Science Friday. Today on the show, how to define genius.
People will say to me, but some people are just smarter than other people. That's what geniuses are. And actually, that's really not how we award the label.
What makes someone a genius? Are they the smartest, most creative, most innovative people? How about those with the highest IQ? Well, my next guest argues that who we consider a genius tells us much more about what we value as a society than any objective measure of brilliance. And without a compelling or quirky life story, you're unlikely to be elevated to the level of genius. Joining me now to explore the complicated and coveted status of genius is my guest, Helen Lewis, staff writer at The Atlantic, author of the book, The Genius Myth, A Curious History of a Dangerous Idea. Welcome to Science Friday.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. Now, anybody who starts a book with a curious history of a dangerous idea, I gotta ask, what do you mean, a dangerous idea?
Well, I think it's something that people get wrong, don't they? I mean, I've been having lots of conversations around this book where people will say to me, but some people are just smarter than other people. That's what geniuses are. And actually, that's really not how we award the label. It usually goes to somebody who encapsulates some quality that we like, or we find that their life stories are kind of parable. So someone like Stephen Hawking would be a good example. There are lots of physicists of his generation with equivalent achievements, but he's the one who became a kind of pop culture celebrity. He's the one who got to be in The Simpsons because people found his personal story so inspiring. So he had ALS, a progressive form of muscular dystrophy, and ended up in a wheelchair. And people found that idea that somebody's brain was still active even as their body was failing them just quite profoundly moving. And so he became this different kind of figure within science than, as I say, any other, Roger Penrose or anybody else of the same generation whose work on paper was just as good.
Mm-hmm. Or Elon Musk, as you start your book with.
Yeah, I felt I had to start with Elon Musk because everybody was having this big argument about him at the time. And actually, I think what happened to him at DOGE, the Department for Government Efficiency, really, it kind of shows what the argument that I was trying to make in the book, which is that there was a feeling among people who were very smart at coding and engineering that every problem was a coding problem. As if, you just throw more computing power at a problem and that solves it. And actually, I mean, you all know this as well as me, I'm sure, political problems are often very knotty simply because they involve people. And so I think Elon Musk went into DOGE thinking, here's me and my crack team of smart 21-year-olds, and we're going to look at the code base of the US government, clean it up, and then that will improve things. And look what has happened. He's got nowhere near the $2 trillion of savings that he promised. And actually, most of the people involved in that, including him, have come out of it feeling quite bruised and kind of with a sense of, why didn't this work? And to me, that's the absolute paradigm of you throw a load of quote unquote geniuses at a problem, and guess what? The problem is a bit more difficult than perhaps the people involved realize, because they value one type of intelligence or one type of genius.
Yeah, so they are really good at very narrow things, but the social consequences or social graces might be lacking.
Right, and politics is the art of making people do what you want, or convincing them that ideas that you have were things that they've always believed themselves anyway, It's fundamentally about people skills.
Mm-hmm. Have we lost the idea then of a political genius, someone who is so smart, changed the paradigm and everybody's excited about that person?
Well, there are different types of genius. I think politics is a place where you can make a version of what we would have once called kind of great man theory, that there are certain individuals who really do change the course of history. But science, I think, is very different to that. So one of the things I found during my research, which was most mind-blowing, is this 1922 paper called Our Inventions Inevitable. And it goes through, it's now quite a famous paper, goes through all of the things that got invented basically around the same time. And thinkers like Stephen Johnson and Malcolm Gladwell are kind of, I think, slightly obsessed with this paper because it overturns everything you think about how scientific discoveries happen. It suggests instead that they're kind of, when the preconditions of them have been met, somebody will get there. 3 people discovered nitrogen in the air in the same year. That was just kind of ready to happen, essentially.
Right. Ideas happen. I'm thinking of Isaac Newton and calculus. He wasn't the only one.
Oh, I mean, I love Isaac Newton because he's such a fantastic historical figure. But yeah, Gottfried
Talk about
Leibniz,
genius,
and hailed as a genius. And what's really interesting about him is, well, 2 things I think are fascinating from the story. One is that obviously the discovery of gravity, incredible breakthrough in science, brilliant. But that wasn't what he spent most of his life doing. He spent most of his life obsessed with alchemy, trying to turn base metals into gold, and with biblical chronology, i.e. working out exactly when events in the Bible could have happened historically. So he spent a lot of time down kind of dead ends. And then the other thing is, as you mentioned, one of the things he's most famous for now is the simultaneous discovery of calculus, and spending many, many years trying to destroy his rival's reputation, make sure that he got the credit for it. And you do find that story in a lot of self-proclaimed geniuses, right? That they want it, they go after it. They're not very willing to share the limelight.
Boy, is that true. I mean, as a science journalist, I could name a couple of names there, but...
Yeah. Well, I would love it if you did, but I think it's really fascinating. You know, I talked to Walter Isaacson a while ago,
Right.
and his book career is fascinating to me because obviously he's written biographies of Da Vinci, of Einstein, and Steve Jobs, latterly, and Elon Musk. He also wrote a book about Jennifer Doudna of gene editing, of CRISPR. And, you know, that which has potential to be an incredibly transformative technology. But she does not have that same aura. You know, she has not been so enthusiastically playing the role of the kind of the great sage delivering a new kind of era for humankind. And I think that's very notable.
Yeah, and that brings up a topic about women in science, and I think you might consider her to be a genius type for coming up with her work, but you don't historically hear the quote label of genius given to many women over the centuries, right?
I think it's very notable. I think there's obviously, particularly historically, there are social factors. One of the things that really stood out to me in my research was that there was a brilliant female physicist of the late 19th century and early 20th century called Hertha Ayrton. And she did great work in arc lights and some other stuff that was very innovative at the time. She won the Hughes Medal from the Royal Society, but she couldn't join the Royal Society. You know, they only admitted women in the 1940s.
Madame Curie couldn't get into
Right,
the
she only got her
societies.
professorship after she essentially inherited it from Pierre, her late husband. You know, that's somebody who won 2 Nobel Prizes in different disciplines, like one of the greatest scientists of the 20th century. One of the things I wanted to talk about is the role of collaboration. And, you know, I think we often downplay the roles of those societies and of universities. But scientists themselves through history have been really well aware of what it means to be, you know, at the edge. You need to know what everybody else is doing at the edge of the field. You need to know where the kind of interesting work is being done. And so excluding women, Black Americans were very often locked out of them, working class people locked out of them, Jewish people locked out of the Ivy League in the beginning of the 20th century. You know, there have been large swathes of Americans who have not been able to access the resources that they needed to fully develop their talents.
What do you think the idea of male genius is interesting? I mean, women have been excluded from science, you know. Why even now?
I mean, I think it was always framed went up to it, and I think it was the other way around, actually, right? It was a fear that they could compete. And you see that, you know, there was lots of discussion at the end of the 19th century about the fact that women shouldn't be admitted to universities because they didn't really have the brains for it. Now we have the opposite problem, right? That actually lots of courses are dominated at undergraduate and even taught graduate level by women. So it's, you know, that clearly wasn't a problem. And there's another thing too, which I think hero worship really comes into it. When you're talking about people being you're kind of really talking often about hero worship. And we know, for example, that women are quite happy to read books by both genders. Men are quite reluctant to read books written by women. And I think there's something slightly emasculating for some men. They feel that, you know, being kind of adoring a woman would somehow be really humbling to them.
After the break, how Albert Einstein became synonymous with the word genius.
He turned into a kind of public intellectual and celebrity, and he was obviously comfortable with that role.
Don't go away.
If you're watching the Apple TV Plus series Chief of War, you're going to want to listen to Feathers and Fire, the podcast from Hawaii Public Radio that takes a closer look at the groundbreaking series. Our hosts provide additional context to the Hawaiian history and culture portrayed in the series, as well as humorous insight and behind-the-scenes stories from guests. Available wherever you get your podcasts and from hawaiipublicradio.org.
So speaking of hero worship, let's talk about Albert Einstein for a moment, because he is the iconic genius. His wild hair, that's like become the symbol of somebody who's a genius. What was it about him and the age he lived in that made him so much that icon of geniusness?
I mean, I would start by saying that I think people often, when they think about the book, assume that it's a kind of debunking of me taking a lot of men down at the knees, and that's not not true at all, and make the picture more complicated and broader. And Einstein is a good example of this, right? Because he is undoubtedly one of the greatest scientists ever. Just came up with incredible breakthroughs and just fundamentally changed physics. But there's lots of interesting things about him. He wasn't a particularly incredible student at university. Part of the legend is that he was working in a patent office when he made his breakthroughs because he couldn't get an academic job. But the other thing is that he turned into a kind of public intellectual and celebrity, and he was obviously comfortable with that role. He speculated about the existence of God. He took a stance on nuclear weapons. Obviously, as a refugee from Europe to America, as a Jewish refugee, he had a very strong opinions on the politics of the Second World War. All of those things meant that he was essentially a sage. By the time that he died, he was a celebrity, and he was the one that people had on t-shirts and they'd make pilgrimages to see him. He was no longer at the forefront of where the edge of physics research was. He was a kind of elder statesman of the entire field, and it's a slightly different role.
Yeah, so this was about his persona besides his achievements then.
But also something about, you mentioned that, the kind of the wild hair and the famous picture
Yes.
with his tongue stuck out. That's
Central casting at Hollywood.
Well, but where does that idea come from, right? Because that's not an idea that people had in the 1600s of what it meant to be a genius. But the idea of that kind of childlike wonder of the genius is really an idea that kind of fully blossoms in the 18th century with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The idea that actually what's most pure in children is nature, and we corrupt it by schooling them, drilling them in times tables and whatever else it might be. And since then, there's been a really high premium on that kind of the idea of the genius as the free spirit that comes along in a couple of different ways. One of which I have a very conflicted relationship, which was the idea of the heretic. There are so many stories about the one person in science standing up to the kind of the establishment that doesn't get it. So Ignaz Semmelweis and the germ theory of disease, or Galileo and the heliocentric universe. And those stories are often a little bit more complicated, and then you have stories like someone like Freeman Dyson, undoubtedly a very brilliant mind, but by the end of his life a climate change denier. Unfortunately, you can draw a direct line from that, I think, to that kind of heterodox podcast sphere, where anything that the establishment says by definition is probably flawed and faulty, and the most fringe ideas are therefore the most interesting, and shouldn't we look into them?
This is Science Friday from WNYC Studios. Let's talk a bit about, I remember when I grew up, that's how old I am, when people used to talk about the role of IQ all the time. Very important. Your kids we have to measure his or her IQ. You write that members of high IQ societies are not typically the most successful people in society. Why is that?
Well, I've got bad news for you if you were enjoying a brief respite from the IQ discourse, because it's really come roaring back. I mean, to go back to Elon Musk, one of many people in Silicon Valley who are really obsessed with IQ. The people in the early 20th century were interested in it, because they feel that there are certain kinds of superior people, maybe even superior races. So I think IQ discourse is coming back. But yes, one of the things I found most joyful, I'm a political journalist by background, so I spent a lot of time covering fringe political parties, which schism with delightful frequency, right? Because the stakes are quite low. No one's actually ever going to be in power over everything. So all they have really are their principles. And there's something similar that happens in the ultra high IQ society. So the one people might have heard of is Mensa, and that takes the top 1 to 2% of the population. But there are ones that are way, way, way beyond that. And they do become, I would say, like bold men fighting over a comb, but they become kind of incredibly smart people fighting over the minutes of a meeting. It just, their propensity for people to have these dramatic fallings out. And also get into huge arguments about who the smartest person is, even within this coterie of very smart people. People who really value their smartness, often are very attached to it.
Yeah. Should we retire the word genius, you think, altogether?
I don't think we ever will. So I think my campaign against it, that wouldn't make any difference even if I had it. I think we do want a word for something that is kind of extraordinary, and for somebody that we maybe even admire, or maybe just we don't feel is kind of entirely human, right? We almost don't know how they did it.
Yeah. How do we celebrate them? People who have done truly incredible and society positive things.
I think it's a harder question than that, which is how do we celebrate teams?
teams.
I think we have a model for celebrating individual scientists, right? Notoriously, the Nobels in the sciences can go to a maximum of 3 people. And there's a lot of quite low-level disgruntlement with that because, inevitably it means that some people glom on to a discovery like William Shockley with the transistor, which I write about in the book, or sometimes you get a situation in which it's fairly arbitrary who gets their name on the plaque and who doesn't. I mean, I was just thinking about how much, I don't know if you liked it, but I really liked the film Oppenheimer.
Yes.
Because
yes,
it
I
was a
did.
very rare example of that film was not, Oppenheimer didn't make those breakthroughs himself, right? His genius, if you want to call it that, was to bring together Enrico Fermi or Richard Feynman, these big egos, these awkward personalities, and put them together in a desert and get them to do their best work as a team. And that we just very rarely talk about that or have a way to celebrate that.
We're talking about Elon Musk, and I think as a society, we're much more likely now to hold people accountable for bad behavior, even if we review and view them as geniuses. And people seem generally delighted to see Elon Musk make a fool of himself on the national stage, and then his genius card gets revoked, even briefly. Is this the genius myth fading or changing, or how do you look at that?
Well, I was trying to work out, and I never quite worked out the perfect way to say it, but the idea that calling someone a genius is often a way of having an argument that a society wants to have. You're right that his genius card has been revoked, which is sort of weird when you think about it, right? There's nothing about what he's done with the federal government that makes the achievements of Tesla or SpaceX or the Boring Company anything different from what they were before. I think people on the left think that it sort of retrospectively debunks him and everything else he's done. And I don't feel like that. I feel like he has made some really interesting and significant contributions to American scientific life. But I think his problem was grandiosity. He kind of came in like he was a sort of stunt motorcyclist going like, hey, stand back, losers, and watch this, I'm going to be amazing. And then if that person then falls into a lake of custard, that is inevitably quite funny. And so I think his own arrogance brought that down on him, really.
You see this often, though, in people who've won Nobel Prizes and are labeled as geniuses. Suddenly they think they're a genius in a field that they know nothing about.
Yeah, and they get treated like that. It happened to Thomas Edison, who was sort of treated as a kind of sage in his later life when his kind of creative juice slightly run out. And I think people get turned into a kind of 360-degree wise man, and it usually is a man. Why would somebody who is a brilliant chemist necessarily have incredibly good views on politics, right? Any more than a politician would be able to make a breakthrough in organic chemistry.
Thank you for taking time to be with us today.
Oh, well, thank you for talking to me. I always love the history of science is always such a pleasure to talk about because it's filled with so many big characters who you not necessarily want to spend much time with in real life, are fun to spend time with on.
Hi, this is Ira Plato, and you're listening to Science Friday. Today on the show, what disaster plans are in place in case a large asteroid is on track to hit a populated area on Earth.
It was a lot to wrestle with because you have to take into account all this other risk with just taking action with an asteroid.
You might remember a news item from the beginning of the year that felt like it was ripped from the sci-fi movie headlines. An asteroid about 180 feet long had about a 3% chance of hitting Earth in 8 years, and if it did, it would unleash 500 times the amount of energy of the nuclear bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But after further observations, astronomers revised that probability down, way down to close to zero. So what is our current capability to spot earthbound asteroids? And how would governments prepare citizens? Here with some of the answers are Dr. Kelly Fast, Acting Planetary Defense Officer at NASA's Planetary Defense Coordinating Office. L.A. Lewis, former FEMA liaison. Anna Virginia, welcome both of you to Science Friday.
Oh, thank you, Ira.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Nice to have you both. Kelly, let me begin with you because it sounded like you had a busy start to the year. Can you take us back to when you heard about that asteroid, what your reaction was?
Yes, it was a busy start to the year. At the end of December, we heard that an asteroid had been discovered that posed a very like that, and with more observations, it's found that it's going to safely pass by. But in this case, it was apparent that this is going to hang around a little longer before we know for sure one way or another. And so it was an interesting process in January as more observations were taken to help try to narrow down in 2032 where exactly it was going to go. The worldwide capabilities, both at NASA and around the world, have come so far over the years. One of the Atlas telescopes of the University of Hawaii that was located down in Chile discovered this asteroid 2024 YR4. So here we have these discoveries popping up, more than we had before at a much higher rate than before, getting more of a heads up on what could be coming our way.
Is there a size, though, a size limit? It has to be a big enough kind of asteroid that you can spot it? I mean, what about the smaller ones?
Well, exactly. In terms of the size, it just depends, because the small ones we can spot too. If they're close, we can spot the large ones, much further away. And so it just all depends. And this asteroid 2024 YR4 has passed through the inner solar system before, but we play this game of tag around the sun, and the Earth just hasn't been at the right spot previously. And so that was important there at the end of 2024, where things lined up just right, where it was actually a fairly bright object, and then it raced away and became faint fairly quickly. So sometimes it truly just depends. And that's why the search for asteroids, it's not something that can happen overnight. It does take years. You have to wait for the solar system to bring the asteroids around the sun to us. But as our capabilities are better, we can spot smaller ones further and further away, but we still have to wait for the solar system to bring them to us as well.
Our popular culture is filled with films about what would happen if we found it in our direction. Would we destroy it? What would we do these days if we found one? Didn't we have a mission to an asteroid to sort of nudge it out of the way?
We indeed did. We had a demonstration mission to test one method for deflecting an asteroid, should we ever need it in the future. It was NASA's Double Asteroid Redirection Test, or DART. And it was a successful test of impacting a spacecraft into an asteroid and actually changing its motion in space. And so that kind of gave us a tool in the toolbox. And the other mission aspect is also reconnaissance. As you probably saw with the DART mission, the asteroid that it impacted, we didn't get a good look at it until right before impact. Can you imagine how valuable if there was an asteroid that posed an impact threat to Earth, and to actually send a mission out to it and study its properties, and then if we needed to deflect it, to be able to have that information to really design an effective deflection mission. So again, having that time, that's why we want to find the asteroids well ahead of time, to have those options.
And LA, you guys really, you practice this stuff. You have asteroid kind of war games, right?
Yes. We try not to use the word war games, as you can imagine in my business. Some people get concerned about saying war games, but yes, we've had a series of exercises since 2013 by my NASA colleagues in Homeland Security leadership. We're very familiar with us. The area of planetary defense and asteroid impact, like you said, Ira, it was, it's in movies and stuff, and I don't think people took it as before when we started this effort.
Is it really like a game, a computer simulation where you play one role and you get like a sealed envelope and you go from there?
We started doing some of those techniques earlier, but the first couple of exercises were all tabletop exercises. But I wanted to challenge the Federal Emergency Response Agency. So the first couple of exercises, we had short warning times, 6 months or less, where that would require everybody to pay attention and start doing the required action. But also, what's the public communications for that? If we show up hurricane charge, people would get that. But if we started showing them information from a possible asteroid impact, that would be unfamiliar to a lot of the American public. And we kind of consider it a win, not an if situation.
Well, how do you prepare the public for this? And is it part of your simulation that you have to convince people who are in the decision process, government people, to talk to the public or get them ready?
I think it's sort of a combination of both of those things, Ira, from USGS, from NASA, from NOAA, from all the other agencies that will participate. The key thing that I think is just give out as much information, be as truthful as possible, get it out as soon as possible, and show yourselves as the authority, because other people will join in. They'll have their own scientific theories. They'll say we're all wrong. It's going to impact here, not there. We made a lot of progress. My project that I was working on before I retired this past December was actually getting down into specifics as to what the actual notification process would be here in the U.S. with regard to, going down from the whole movie, the discovery, and we got to do some of this earlier, as Kelly said, with 2024 YR4. And then one time we actually had a community volunteer to be the quote unquote victim of an asteroid impact, and that was Winston-Salem, North Carolina. We did a joint exercise with them, all their firefighters and emergency management personnel. We all were on a joint conference, and we kind of did it like we were actually going to respond to it. But we also had an incident where we had somebody actually come on the internet and present a whole entire counter to what we were presenting, just to see how people react and how to deal with it. Say fake news that people were denied this is happening. We're all Americans, Some Americans tell us to get lost even when we tell them there's an actual hurricane, and they can see it on the news. They're going to stay home. So there are all kind of complications that we wanted to start working into the actual exercise.
That's really interesting to hear that you had an actual simulation on the ground there. Kelly, let's talk about, you were at the Planetary Defense Conference in South Africa earlier this year, where they were exploring a simulation where an asteroid was on track to hit Johannesburg, and they had a very difficult choice to make. Bring us into that room. What were the possible scenarios you were talking about?
Right, and ultimately it was actually a little further north there in southern Africa where the impact could be, but it was discussed, like if you were to divert the asteroid one way, the goal would be to divert it off the Earth altogether. But as you try to divert the asteroid off the Earth, in the future you'd want to make sure that it actually passes the Earth. If it doesn't, then what is affected? Now, if you diverted the asteroid one way, it turns out you would end up over the ocean or over Antarctica and then eventually off the Earth. So the risk was not so high to divert in that direction, but the other direction, you were diverting across a lot of the continent of Africa, a lot of, and also Europe, before you could actually divert the asteroid off the Earth. But it was easier to divert in that direction. So it was a lot to wrestle with, because you have to take into account all this other risk with just taking action with an asteroid. It's not necessarily simple and straightforward. And also, you brought up earlier the DART mission. Something like that on its own isn't necessarily the solution, because it might take multiple kinetic impactors to divert an asteroid, or it might need another technique. I always talk about the Hollywood technique, but there actually are studies done on how a nuclear deflection might take place. There's other techniques, ion beam, but it really depends on the scenario, the lead time and the size of the asteroid. And at the Planetary Defense Conference, they were wrestling with the deflection and how many missions might be needed to do it, and how to get it all the way off the Earth, and whether you're putting other areas on the Earth at risk as you're doing it.
One of the other things we wrestle with as emergency responders is how would you deal with transnational migrations, because you have to do large-scale evacuations that might be international. So it's a lot more complicated. So that's why the value of the exercises is important to go through.
Well, does the exercise actually take into effect all the politics involved in getting all those international agencies and governments together to figure out what to do?
I think we try to acknowledge it, but we definitely don't try to solve it in our exercises. But it's good for us to go through it one of the things I always like to tell my science colleagues, and believe me, I am a strong science advocate, but one of the bottom lines is that we have to consider that, we're dealing with fellow human beings, with fellow citizens, but the decision to actually do something is not entirely a science decision, in my opinion. It's a political decision.
Yeah, and that sounds a little more difficult.
It does seem so straightforward in the movies, maybe with one scientist out there warning everybody, but it's a whole community pulling together the technical information, but then we're just bringers of the information, and we have some of the options for response when it comes to space. Emergency management has it when it comes to the ground. Now, the nice thing is, over the past decade, there are collaborations in place that will hopefully help with that decision. There's 2 UN recommended collaborations, the International Asteroid Warning Network, which is observers and modelers around the world, and NASA actually leads that, and the Space Mission Planning Advisory Group that's chaired by the European Space Agency. And that is the forum for the world's space agencies and space offices to come together and collaborate on a response to a potential asteroid impact threat. And so even though ultimately it's individual nations that would fund any type of response, we already have this collaboration in place to provide mission options. So that's also very valuable.
We have to take a quick break, but don't go away. More on this when we come back.
Bad things happen, and we should be prepared as best we can to contribute to being ready for this.
If you're watching the Apple TV Plus series Chief of War, you're going to want to listen to Feathers and Fire, the podcast from Hawaii Public Radio that takes a closer look at the groundbreaking series. Our hosts provide additional context to the Hawaiian history and culture portrayed in the series, as well as humorous insight and behind-the-scenes stories from guests. Available wherever you get your podcasts and from hawaiipublicradio.org.
I know there's work on an upcoming satellite called NEO Surveyor, specifically that would look for planet-threatening asteroids. Is that right? How far is that development going?
Right, that development is underway. NEO Surveyor is being developed to really speed things up in terms of finding the asteroids that could potentially pose an impact threat to Earth. And NEO Surveyor will be surveying along Earth's orbit where the asteroids that pose the greatest threat to Earth, be able to survey closer to the direction of the sun than is possible from the ground, and also looking in the infrared, seeing the heat signatures from asteroids, and not being so sensitive to the amount of light that they're reflecting, like the telescopes on the ground, picking up their heat signatures, getting a better idea of their sizes. And so NEO Surveyor, in concert with the telescopes on the ground, that's going to really speed things up in terms of finding potential threats to Earth, and for us, at NASA, for addressing a tasking that Congress gave us many years ago to inventory asteroids 140 meters and larger that could pose a hazard to Earth. And though all along we're trying to pick up asteroids of any size that could pose a hazard, anything we find, get it in the catalog and be able to check off, okay, that's not the one we're worried about, let's keep looking.
Right. Well, NASA has recently just cut a lot of space budgeting, a lot of science budgeting, specifically, for example, the return sample mission from Mars, other kinds of science that is not human oriented. How do we know that this NEO Surveyor is not going to be axed also?
Well, the administration has continued to say that planetary defense is a priority, and that protecting the planet's a priority. And so things continue with the NEO Surveyor spacecraft. So working ahead to meeting that goal that Congress has set for us.
And now that you say that you have to continue to do this, how surreal is it to do this work? I mean, you sit in these simulations, you talk about potentially the end of the world, or the major destruction of a city. LA, how surreal is this?
Wow, Ira, that is the best question, because I never thought, when I was a kid, I'm the Apollo era kid, so I watched all the Apollo missions, and for a while, every kid wanted to be an astronaut. So for me, I'm a retired naval officer to actually do something that's concerning protecting the entire planet, but also being practical about, bad things happen and we should be prepared as best we can as citizens to contribute to being ready for this. But I have to say, it is something that I never in my wildest dreams thought that I'd be working with NASA and sitting down with scientists like Kelly Fast and actually listening to the things I used to talk about and dream about as a kid, and actually be in a position where I can actually do something about it.
Kelly?
Oh, I agree with LA. In fact, he and I are both big Star Trek fans and sci-fi geek. But then, in a way, you feel like you're living it in this job. But it's also sobering because there's you're rooted in reality, but you're kind of informed by that cool sci-fi side of things. But to also have science that can be applied to people's everyday lives, like space weather, like planetary defense. It's just a privilege to be involved in that, and a heavy responsibility too. But it's encouraging because it isn't just about the one scientist in the movie who's running around trying to handle everything. There's a fantastic team of people, and then our collaborations with FEMA. It all made that very fulfilling to be able to be involved in such an activity.
Well, we have run out of time, but I can't think of a better way to end it than you guys talking about it that way. Dr. Kelly Fast, Acting Planetary Defense Officer at NASA, and Leviticus L.A. Lewis, former FEMA liaison to the Planetary Defense Office. Thank you both for taking time to be with us today.
Thank you, Ira. It's been great.
Yes, thanks for having us, Ira.
You're welcome. Hey, thanks for listening. This episode was produced by D. Peter Schmidt. See you next time. I'm Ira Flato.